How's it going, viewers? Welcome back to another video. And today, since we have had now one shakedown and 1 week of Bahrain testing, this video is going to be a recap on everything that happened on the 3 days of week 1 of Bahrain testing. We've got a lot to talk about. There's a lot of controversy, a lot of statements from drivers about how the cars work. We're going to talk about what the pecking order may or may not be, who's performed well, who's underperformed, all this kind of thing. So we're going to get into all of that in this video. Hopefully you all enjoy. It's going to be a long one, and we got some questions from viewers to answer as well. But without further ado, let's get straight into it. Question the back. That is okay. So the first thing I think we're going to get into in this video talking about is the pecking order for the season. What do we think is happening? Obviously, there were quite a few teams which caught the attention, maybe for the wrong reasons. I think there were a few teams who were considerably worse than expected. There were a few teams who were considerably better than expected. But we're gonna get into that, and we're gonna start straight away with a question from @GrilledPixels, otherwise known as Jed, who asks, "How cooked is Aston Martin in your opinion?" This is probably the best place to start, because I think it is probably the most definitive answer or definitive thing we can talk about in this segment of the video. How cooked is Aston Martin? Look, it doesn't look good. Obviously, coming into this season, we were going, oh, Aston, they've got the Newey, so they've got Adrian Newey in there now. They've got Honda, who were really good with Red Bull for the past 3 years. All the stars were aligning, and it looked like they were probably going to be the third best car. If you had asked anyone what they thought the pecking order was going to be back in January, a lot of them would have probably put Aston Martin in that top 3, top 4 sort of range for the team. But at the moment, it's looking like the complete opposite. It's looking like the complete opposite. Obviously, like Lawrence Stroll was seen getting out of his Aston Martin at the track and looking, quite frankly, miserable. You had Alonso jumping out of the car after day 1 and throwing his gloves at the wall out of frustration. Lance Stroll saying that if he had to guess, they were probably 4.5 seconds off the pace. Those are that is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what is going on with Aston at the moment. But I would probably say they are comfortably the worst team at the moment. One of the big things which sort of played into this, which played into how bad they were, was the talk around the Honda engine. I read quite a few articles and reports about how the Honda engine was struggling to go beyond 11,000 RPM on the straights, essentially without failing, without blowing itself apart. And when you've got the other teams like Ferrari, Mercedes, and RBPT, who are, extracting nearly 12,100 RPM, nearly 1,000 RPM more than the Honda engine, it makes for grim reading. An RPM of that difference, you're looking at anywhere between 15 to 25 km/h difference on the straights. The Aston Martin peaked at about 318 kilometers an hour on the main straight on day 3, whereas the Ferrari engine under Charles Leclerc was peaking at 12,100 RPM at about 331 kilometers an hour, which is an enormous deficit. That's 3/10, not per lap, but 3/10 a straight you are looking at with that sort of deficit. So it already doesn't look good. And the problem with that is, if you've got an engine which is performing that poorly, it then doesn't link up with the chassis. For all we know, the Adrian Newey chassis and design could be the best on the grid, but when you don't have an engine to match that performance, the chassis becomes completely irrelevant in its design. And whether we like it or not as fans, this is an engine formula. No doubt about it. This is an engine formula. 70% of the performance in these 2026 cars is going to be in what the engine can do. And when you have that combined with an engine which cannot rev without tearing itself apart, it just doesn't make for a good combo. So Aston, definitely one of the worst teams at the moment, behind Cadillac, behind Alpine, Audi, all this kind of stuff. So it doesn't look good. And because of that, you know, is this going to be Alonso's last year? But there were encouraging signs. Obviously, there was a quote from Alonso who said, I believe on Friday, who said along the lines of, we're finding time in the engine all the time, and the more we drive it, the more it becomes more resistant and less likely to explode. And they said, you know, every test they're running, they're gaining about 0.8 in performance, so they're definitely bad at the moment. I think they probably won't be great going into Australia and round 2 in China, but I think once we start getting into the middle of the season, races like Austria, Canada, Catalonia, that kind of thing, where they're probably not going to be as bad. They're probably going to find themselves back in the midfield. But yeah, a lot of performance to find for Aston Martin, but I don't think you can count them out completely for the season as a whole at the moment. And we've still got more testing to come. But we're going to keep moving it on. I'm going to move to other teams on the grid. And we're going to head over to, I think, a team which, going into this year, didn't have a lot of hype around it for very good reason, but I think is just beginning to emerge slightly as a team which could actually challenge for the title. That is Ferrari. Obviously, the SF25 was a pile of hot garbage, no other word for it. It was pretty poor in every sense of the matter. But with the new test, you know, they're looking reliable. They're looking fairly quick as well. And honestly, it is encouraging signs for Ferrari. Obviously, I don't think it is a bit early to tell with only being week 1. But Ferrari, especially with their engine, I think Ferrari have done a very good job with their engine and how it manages, and crucially, in reliability. And obviously this could be a huge jinx. What I'm about to say, but on the surface, it looks like Ferrari does have the most reliable engine. Obviously there were 3 teams using Ferrari power. We've got Ferrari, obviously, Haas, and Cadillac. Cadillac have had 2 breakdowns. There was a stoppage on day 1, for Valtteri, who came to a stop about 3 hours into the morning session, and then there was a stop on day 3 for Sergio Perez in the afternoon. Apart from that, Ferrari haven't had any other failures. We don't know if it's engine. For Cadillac, it could be an electronics thing, it could be a hydraulics thing, which it's unclear. But apart from those 2 stoppages, the Ferrari engine looks phenomenally reliable at this point in the season. And honestly, when you've got a reliable engine in an engine formula, it does make for good results. If you look back to 2014, when we had an engine formula, the Renault was fairly unreliable along with the Ferrari, but the Mercedes was fairly reliable in its engine, and it goes to show they absolutely dominated the championship. So when you have a reliable engine in an engine formula, it does make for good reading. But the Ferrari engine looking very good at the moment, and it ties me on nicely to the next point I was going to make, and that a team which didn't do too poorly last year, was sort of in the midfield, are sort of emerging as one of the dark horses at the moment who could possibly threaten the top 4, and that is Haas. Obviously running on Ferrari power, it ties into what I was just talking about how the Ferrari engine is looking good, about how the team itself is looking good, but that pace and that performance seems to have transferred over into the Haas team. Obviously, Ao Komatsu, who's been doing a very good job in the last few years at bringing Haas up to really where they deserve to be after quite a few lackluster years under Mr. Gunther. But, you know, they've very quietly been going about their run plans and their business. They haven't had a single fault, a single mechanical fault. Ocon was 4th in the runnings on day 1, with Ollie Behrman in 6th day 2 and Ocon 5th on day 3. You know, obviously testing times don't matter a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but it is highly encouraging. So honestly, we get to round 4, round 5, and I would expect Haas to be top of the midfield, 5th best car, and on occasion maybe sneaking into that top 6 in the running order. But it is very, very encouraging for Haas, and definitely one which not a lot of people saw coming. This was definitely, you know, Haas going into testing and people going like, oh, it's Haas, you know, they'll be 7th place or whatever. Like, we haven't really expected Haas to be sort of up at this end of the running order, but it is good to see, and I think they very much could be a pain in the arse for some of the top teams like Red Bull and McLaren. And then the other thing regarding the pecking order is, well, really, who do we think is quickest at this stage of testing? Obviously, if you look at the media and what the drivers have been saying on regarding who is quick, who isn't, teams and drivers will always say, oh, they are the quickest and not themselves, because one of the ways of hiding your own performance is claiming that you are slow and deflecting the sort of praise onto other drivers and teams. If you look at what Lando Norris said, he said that looks like Ferrari are the quickest and Red Bull are a close second, and that McLaren are pretty slow. You look at what Max said, and he said that McLaren are probably the fastest. You look at George Russell, who claimed that Ferrari were probably quick, and then you look at Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton and Fred Vasseur, who were saying that McLaren are probably the quickest. So it's all that interchangeable blah 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 from one side and blah 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 from another side, and it's all just deflecting the spotlight away from themselves. So at this stage of testing, you cannot really rely on what the drivers and teams say regarding performance, because it is all just a mismatch of pretentious twaddle. But who do we think is the quickest at the moment? If I had to guess, I would honestly probably say Ferrari looking quick. McLaren and Red Bull probably maybe interchangeably second, or you'd even throw Mercedes. No, I'd probably throw Mercedes into second place. I do think Mercedes are sandbagging just a little bit. Obviously, there was so much hype around the Mercedes engine and the overall package that Merc had come up with, and we haven't really, in the first 3 days of testing, we haven't really seen that promised sort of pace and deliverance that Mercedes was so hyped up to possess. We haven't really seen that yet, which is fairly interesting. So I do think they are sandbagging just a little bit. But Mercedes, probably second. I'd go McLaren third and Red Bull fourth. But the pecking order is very interesting at the moment. I'd probably have Haas in a close fifth place behind Red Bull. Obviously, the dark horses of the season at the moment. Next up in sixth place, I'd probably have Williams. Obviously, there was a lot of news surrounding Williams having missed the Barcelona shakedown. But since then, they've showed up to Bahrain. They've done some of the most laps of any team, and while they don't necessarily look quick out of the gates, they do look reliable. They do look like a team who is going to maximise on opportunities at the moment, and a team which can do quite a few long runs. So it's not anything to be wowed at, but it is definitely encouraging for Williams. So I'd probably throw them in 6th place at the moment. 7th place, I'd probably go for Audi. The car, especially the chassis on the Audi, looking quite temperamental to drive. Quite a few swaps and lockups and hairy moments for Bortoleto and for Hulkenberg. So it looks like a bit of a handful to drive at the moment. But all things considered, it doesn't look too bad for Audi. Number 8, I'd probably go with Alpine. They haven't done anything to suggest they're quick, but they haven't done anything to suggest that they're slow either. They're probably middle of the pack. They had a few teething troubles with engine, so they might be in a bit of trouble. We don't know. I'd throw them in 8th place. Number 9, probably Cadillac, looking okay, not looking too bad in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, it being the brand new team, it is hard to tell where Cadillac will be. For anything we know, they could be 5th. they could be the fifth fastest team, but with them, it is hard to tell. And then in 10th and 11th, obviously, in 11th place is Aston Martin. No doubt about that in my mind. Definitely the slowest at the moment of the teams, obviously, with the engine problems. And then, finally, probably V-Carb, I would put in 10th place. Just sort of same as Alpine with V-Carb. We just haven't seen anything indicative of if they're fast, if they're slow, if they're in the mid-pack, if they're at the back, if they're at the front. So one of very two anonymous teams which haven't had any of media coverage or anything like that, so it's very hard to tell, but I'd definitely be throwing V-Carb in that 10th spot. Okay, so now we are going to move on to probably the most controversial part of the video. This is all the talk, especially around the comments of Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso about how Formula 1 is turning essentially into Formula E and how the management is ridiculous and it's anti-racing and all this kind of stuff. But we're going to talk about it because it's one of the most important parts of testing this week. And what are my opinions on it? I think it is a bunch of nonsense, quite frankly. All of this complaining about how we're managing too much and it ruins racing. It's just a bunch of nonsense. There was a really good statement from Martin Brundle about this. Essentially, he said, if you look back to the 80s and the 90s in qualifying and the races, you were constantly managing because of turbos and fuel and managing the engine, all this kind of stuff. Managing has always been a part of Formula 1, whether we like it or not. It sort of went away a bit with the regulations between 2017 and 2021. There wasn't as much managing there because the cars were a lot quicker, and the drivers have very much become accustomed to that way of driving. But now that we're back in an engine formula, managing is back. For better or for worse, we don't know, but it is definitely, and my opinion is definitely, Formula 1 is always full of challenges. It is a constantly evolving sport. It changes all the time, and drivers have to adapt to that. And the whole narrative of whinging and saying that you're going to retire and saying that it's anti-racing and all this stuff is just exhausting, because at the end of the day, you want to have you want the drivers to be challenged, and you want them, to take on that challenge and to not just crumble and quit at the first hurdle. But it brings me on nicely to a tweet or a tweet/article which I read this morning before recording this, and it is absolutely phenomenal. Sums up really well, so I'm going to read it now. It is from the @FormulaUR_ account or Formula Runner right here, but I'm going to read it out because this sums it up beautifully. He says, and this is now me quoting, he says, "I'm always reminded of something James Allison said at the start of the ground effect era in that 2017-2021 era of Formula 1 car, altered drivers and fans' perceptions of what F1 cars should be like. Drivers, fans, and engineers get accustomed to taking certain corners at ridiculous speeds never seen before, and they're always posed a danger of struggling to accept anything less after a certain amount of time. Turn 12 at Bahrain in 2026 is a perfect example. To save energy, teams are taking turn 12 at around 240 kilometers an hour in testing. That is, on a 40-degree track with a bit of fuel in the car, on a medium tyre, not as full qualifying simulation. Come Q3, that figure will probably be 250 kilometers an hour plus, which is in line with numbers pre-2017, as in 2016 and before. To add to that, this way of driving also gives them much higher top speeds on the main straights than before, so there's always pros and cons to everything. You can also see how the experienced drivers view it versus the less experienced drivers. Drivers such as Antonelli, Hadjar, Behrman have no long-term memory of 2017-2025 levels of downforce and grip. So a 2026 F1 car still feels like a massive step up to what they are used to. Experienced drivers last drove cars with these speeds 10 years ago, and they feel like a massive step down. End of tweet/article. Now, that in its entirety is spot fucking on. Absolutely spot on. And like everything that Formula UR has said there is spot on. Really, really good, because it exposes the maybe harsh reality of Formula 1, of an engine formula, of testing. Remember, we are still in testing. If this was Q3 in Australia, this would be a completely different conversation, because that line in there summed it up brilliantly. He said, in testing, they're going 240 kilometers an hour through turn 12. In Q3, you'll be going 20 kilometers an hour faster. Spot on, because this isn't Q3. This is testing. This is an opportunity for the teams to go at 90% pace, understand the car, know what the car is doing and how it behaves, and learning all of that without going balls to the wall. That is what Q3 is for. Q3 is for going flat out, on the limit, no saving, no nothing, and we will see that in a month's time in Q3 in Australia. But a lot of fans, and this is a fan thing, which has blown this whole situation out of proportion. What it has done is people forget that this is testing, right? It's very different to a Grand Prix weekend, and that is one of the things which has blown this whole situation out of the water. Obviously, there were the comments from Lando Norris and George Russell about the whole retiring. For me, I see that as a completely different kettle of fish to what is actually being discussed here about the engines themselves. But managing has always been a part of Formula 1. It never won't be a part of Formula 1. And the quicker that drivers and fans accept that, the better the sport will be, and it will put it in a better place. We're going to move on away from some of the Formula E allegations now, and we're going to move on to a question from @FST_verb, a very loyal viewer. He says, and this is a bit dumb, what are your thoughts on the Mario Kart type of starting boost? Which essentially what that means is, what are the thoughts on sitting there and revving the car up for 10 minutes before being able to get going? It ties into the starting procedures and all this stuff surrounding that. Now, this is something I feel quite confident in talking about, because this has been taken in the complete wrong direction, and the misinformation spread about this type of starting procedure and the engines being warmed up is, quite frankly, a bit pathetic and a bit of a joke. Lots of news places and accounts online taking this in the complete wrong direction. This all started with footage being released of the Audi sitting at the end of the pit lane and revving for 10 seconds to get the battery charged up to get the best start. It did sit there at the end of the pit lane for 10 seconds, but it was not charging the battery. Where this narrative has come from, I don't know. It's probably come out of the allegations that Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso made about it being too close to Formula E. It's been spawned out of that statement. But the fact that they are sitting there for 10 seconds charging the batteries is totally false. They are not doing that at all. What they are actually doing is a term known as turbo spooling, spelt SPOOLING, turbo spooling. What that essentially does is turbos, right? And I am not someone who is technical with cars, but I do have an understanding of the basics. So essentially, turbo spooling in its most nutshell form is that turbos run on pressure, also known as BAR, BAR, and the more pressure you build in the turbo, the quicker the turbo will engage, and then leading to more power and a quicker getaway off the line. And for a turbo to work at its maximum potential, you have to build up the pressure. And how do you build up the pressure? You build up the pressure by revving the engine in a stationary manner, revving it up to its highest RPM, building those revs, building the pressure, and after about 10 seconds, and you can see the correlations here as it all lines up, after about 10 seconds, the turbo, not the battery, the turbo is at maximum pressure, therefore allowing the driver to dump the clutch, shift up into first gear, and getting that maximum performance out of the turbo. And going off of what I just said, you can see the correlation between turbo spooling over here and the whole idea that it's all battery related over here, because it is sort of, on the surface it looks like the same thing. Drivers revving up for 10 seconds to charge the battery, drivers actually revving up for 10 seconds to spool the turbo. On the surface, it looks like it's a battery thing, but it is not. It is all turbo related, and with this engine formula, obviously they are hybrids. Don't get me wrong, they are hybrids, but they are turbo dependent as well. And it is a turbo thing, them standing on the grid and revving the nuts off it in neutral to charge up the turbos, because that is what is actually happening. Obviously, there was a bit of concern, especially from McLaren and Andreas Stella, about the starting procedure and if that is going to need changing. Look, I don't think it will. 10 seconds, because if you're looking at obviously when you have the starting procedure and the formation lap, you'll have the leaders come round and they'll park on the grid, and they will be on the grid anywhere between 13 to 25 seconds, which is plenty of time for the turbo to be spooled. It's a bit more of an issue for the drivers at the back of the grid. I'm looking at the Alpines, I'm looking at the Cadillacs and the Aston Martins. It'll be a bit more of an issue for them because they're on the grid for less. But on average, we've seen in the past between, 2002, give or take, and 2025, on average, the start procedure from the last car forming up on the grid to lights out takes anywhere between 8 and 14 seconds. So it is a window for the turbos to be spooled. I don't think it is going to be much of a problem in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, this whole sort of like precedent of it being a battery related thing has been completely blown out of the water, because it is just not true. And it is a turbo issue instead. But that pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about in recap of round 1 testing. Well, that is going to do it for this video, everybody. Hopefully you all enjoyed. I had a lot of fun talking about some of these and trying to explain things in the best way possible about everything that has happened on day 1 of testing. We've got 3 more days of testing. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Actually, scratch that. Today, tomorrow, and Thursday before we then go racing in Australia on March 8th. But I'm excited for it. It's all broadcast. It's going to be good. But hopefully you all enjoyed. Hopefully you learned a little something as well along the way. Stay safe. Have an awesome day. Make awesome choices. And I'm going to see you all in the next video. Take care, everybody.